One. Hi, my friends. We're live. It's Bradley J for the big broadcast, and we have special guest Carter Allen here. ALAN. Carter Allen. It's a big deal.
Hey, hello, Bradley.
Long time. And we're here to kind of go over Carter's life, Carter's career, but we're going to focus on his writing because I'm really interested in the process of the writing. I'm also interested in how people recreate themselves and shoot out different branches of their careers and their lives. And Carter certainly successfully did that. Carter, thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you, Bradley. It's good to see you again. We go back in the radio, so it's good to see
We sure do go back. Well, we go back even before the radio because we were probably at gigs in like 1979 before I was on the radio, or before I was on BCN anyway. So we have shared a life basically.
Yes, we have.
Now, can you talk a little bit about you pre-radio? Not a lot of people know a lot about the BCN jocks pre-radio. I happen to know you went to college in Henniker, I believe, where my brother went on to be a teacher, a professor. But tell me about you early, pre-radio.
Well, yeah, I went to New England College up in Henniker, New Hampshire, and my interest was originally to get into marine biology. But I really didn't have a good time with. I really had a rough time with the chemistry and the calculus slayed me. So that went away. So I just shifted to my other love, which was writing and literature and music. So I combined a major of music and English, and the idea was that I was going to write. And I graduated. I got my degree, and here I am up in Henniker, and there wasn't much you could do up there. I mean, you could try to work your way into a local paper in Concord, which would be the biggest market. But we were coming down to see concerts at the Orpheum, and so I thought I should move to Boston and try to get a gig working for the Boston Globe. And that was my thing. That was my target, was to come to Boston, work for the Globe. And, this was just before Steve Morse became an immobile rock who would never move, for good reason, because he's such a great writer.
Right.
That was the job I wanted, and I just couldn't get it. So then I'm painting houses, trying to survive in Allston.
You're living in Allston?
I was living, in Allston, and down by the train tracks when they were still there. And, just trying to make things work and painting houses and working for a slumlord. And, everybody's got to do it. You got to keep some money coming in when you're in the city. And I needed to keep doing radio because I had done some radio at New England College on the college station. And I really enjoyed it. And I wanted to keep involving myself in music on the radio. And so I went over and talked to my buddy who was at MIT. He was a brain. He was going to MIT. And he said, there's a radio station here. You should, WTBS, you should check it out. And so I went there, and then they were looking for people to fill up the time because he didn't have enough students who were interested. So they were looking for people from the community. So I started doing radio on the college station. And from there, worked my way to WBCN because, like you were saying, when we were going out in the clubs, I was seeing all these people. I was seeing Oedipus and Tony Berardini and the big bosses at BCN
Right.
and COZ. They were all out seeing shows, and so was I. So that's quite a few years in a real small nutshell.
Yeah, that's the MIT thing is very, very, very interesting. It's a weird station in the basement of the Walker Building of MIT at 3 Ames Street. And you mentioned Oedipus, your boss. He also did a show there, correct?
He did, Demi Monde, and we used to listen to that show. And it was like nothing I'd ever heard about. Because when I was up in New Hampshire, most of my friends were, I came out of the heavy metal thing when I was a kid. I was, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, The Who, all that stuff. That was my deal. And when I got to Henniker, my buddies were all listening to the Grateful Dead, the Allman Brothers, and Hot Tuna, and Jefferson Airplane, and then Starship, all the Todd Rundgren, all the hippie type stuff. And so when I moved to Boston, that was my world, and I get down here and, I was into Bowie and I was into some of that stuff, but what Oedipus was playing was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Urban rock, out of New York and London and in Boston too. And, bands I had not experienced, the Sex Pistols going way back and the Buzzcocks and Willie Alexander, who was, he was like the godfather of the scene. hearing these songs, I didn't like it all, and it took me a little while sort of to kind of migrate towards that. I felt like I couldn't listen to my old stuff if I listened to the new stuff. So it took me a while I worked that out. I was like, no, you can listen to everything. I mean, you could do a radio show and play Willie Alexander and Ultravox and still play David Bowie with Robert Fripp, and it made sense. And you could even play some of the early stuff. You could play, some of the 60s stuff like the Knickerbockers, some of that rock and roll 60s stuff. And that's what Oedipus is doing. And it was kind of cool. It was really cool to hear that and learn about all that music, and I didn't really have a source at first. So I got all of my education from listening to a show.
So there was a big change that happened, and that was basically that Oedipus went to WBCN, and he at first was just a jock there, right? But after he became a person who was hiring people, he would use stations like the MIT station, the BC station, the Emerson station, and others as a farm team to populate his staff. Right. And of course, you were a natural guy. He knew you, and there are others who came out of Emerson, and who else was at TBS or MBR, as it were?
Well, Alberto,
right.
Yeah, Alberto back then.
Yeah.
Actually, Tony Berardini hired Oedipus over. Tony Berardini was the program director. Eventually, he became general manager, and he hired Oedipus, which was inspired. Actually, I think Tommy Hadges before Tony hired him. So they had their ears to the ground and knew that they needed to get an expert who was on the street to fill out BCN's sound, because BCN had always been about the new music, whatever it was, if it was hippie rock or it was reggae or whatever the new thing was. And here was all this street music that they didn't really have an expert doing. So yeah, it was Tommy Hadges that hired Oedipus, and then Tony was there, became the new program director. Tony hired me, and then eventually, not long after, Oedipus became the program director.
I see.
And he was looking for people who knew music. And that was back in the day when the DJs picked all their own music. It was great.
That's the thing.
There was guidance. I mean, if you kind of had a crazy night and played all R&B or something, you might get a talking to by the program director saying, that music you played is all awesome, but you need to kind of spread it out. You want to hit all kinds of different people listening to it.
Right away, you learned the rules, you learned what was expected, and after maybe 6 months, nobody bothered you anymore because you did what you knew you were supposed to do. Pretty
right.
much.
And there was so much music to choose from, and I'll never forget, getting to the show early, half hour early, and picking out records. Sometimes the only song you knew you were going to play was the first or second, and then you just kind of let it go, and you incorporated requests from the audience, and and your show would go a different way. Sometimes it would go somewhere that you never expected it to.
You know how many times? Well, you don't know how many times. That many times the song might have 30 seconds left or 45 seconds left, and you think, oh, I know what would go great, and you have a very small amount of time to run to the back piles of records and find something and drag it out and get it on there really quickly and get the needle down. Oh,
but what a rush, huh?
Yeah, what a rush. And that's the kind of thing the radio bad dreams are made of, by the way, right? I'm sure you've had that bad dream where the record's running out and you're in slow motion and you can't get, someone help me. I can't do this.
I know. Yeah, I've had the DJ nightmares, where there's nothing but commercials and no music.
Wow. So we won't spend too much time on BCN because that's been talked about a lot. Well, this is more about you. And just about the time that around the time Howard came to BCN, you went to ZLX, correct?
That is true. Yeah. I mean, the other thing that should be said is that, because you want to talk about my writing, is radio was the thing that happened. The doors opened at the right time, and I was at a certain point where I was able to walk through them. But the reason I had come to Boston was to be a writer. People know me mainly as a DJ, or at least did back then. But really, the thing I really wanted to do was write. So that was off on the periphery and not at all unusual for me to try to pursue.
I didn't even know that after all this time. I did not know the Boston Globe dream. So this is making a lot more sense to me now.
Right. Well, eventually I started writing for local magazines. I mean, I did do some record reviews for Steve Morris over at the Globe because they had guest writers, and I got in his short list of people that, could write reviews, or if he needed something quick, he knew he could count on me. But I wrote for Pop Top magazine of What's New, Subway News, Boston Rock. These magazines didn't pay a whole lot. I remember Pop Top magazine, you didn't get paid at all. If you did a story on AC/DC, you would get paid the AC/DC albums. They would give you a stack of them and say, write about this, and you get to keep the albums. But that was cool,
Yep.
And so I was doing that, and Boston Beat, these magazines. Sometimes you got paid, sometimes not so much, but it was a way to get your name out there and stay in practice, and maybe get seen by somebody who might hire you to do
Right.
Something more important than that.
So BCN ZLX, where you remain today, WZLX, and you've done many things for WZLX, and you're the midday dude still, right?
I still am. Yeah, I left in '98, came over to ZLX. They wanted a music director, an assistant program director, and a midday jock. And I hadn't been on the air full time for 10 years because the music director at WBCN back in the day only did one show a week on Saturdays. The rest of the time, you needed to be, talking to the record labels and organizing concerts and sitting down with the staff and our music meetings to figure out what we're going to play. So it was, they didn't expect that you could do that and still do a show 5 nights a week. So
that you loved writing, and of course, as anyone who knows you knows, you love U2. So it was natural that you would write a U2 book.
That's right. Yeah, that was the first book. That was back in 91, 92. Actually, I can show it to you. This is the original cover.
Outside is America, after the
And
line of the U2 song.
Faber and Faber, and it came out in England under the title Wide Awake in America, and it did really well. There was only, I loved U2, and through BCN, got to know them on the first visit to town back in December 1980. And over time, I was able to interact with them, doing interviews for not only BCN, but also for them, for the College Radio Network, for some national and international interviews. So I had all this exclusive material. I had a real love of the band. Everybody's got their favorite band. I know you are a Bowie fanatic, and and love Bowie. You love lots of bands, but Bowie is probably your favorite. I at least one of your favorites.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and U2 and the Who could be my 2 favorites. And so I just felt that it'd be cool to write about this band. And so I spent time working on that and didn't know exactly how to write a book. Nobody does when they start out for the first time, but I just treated it like a series of short stories. And in a book like that, you can work your way through chronologically. And so that's how I organized it, and just kept plugging at it, and then actually wrote the book, tried to get an agent, got an agent. Agent said, the book's okay, but you really need to, and they helped me. They took me to, it was like a college, it was like a post-grad writing course with my agent. It was awesome. And so I saw everything with new eyes and completely rewrote the book. And then we shopped it to publishers, and it took a while, but we got Faber and Faber to pick it up. And then
can I interject here before we get too far away from it?
Yep.
So you had written before, you hadn't really written the book. You wrote a book, you did the best you could, but there was stuff you just didn't know. What was in that gap between the first book and the second book? What did they teach you in this college of writing rock and roll knowledge?
Well, it actually was the same book, because I didn't know if I could write a book. So I decided to write it first before I got a hold of anybody. And then when I got a hold of an agent and they signed me up, they took me to school. And
so what did they teach you in school is the short version of the question.
Yeah, how to tighten things up, how to make sure, like in your first chapter, you really want to hit with a bang in the first chapter because, people, they may be in the bookstore and they might pick up your book going, oh, I wonder what this is all about. And that's why covers are really catchy. And anything that's written about what's in the book on the covers or inside covers is really exciting because you want to draw someone in because, if they're not like grabbed in 7 or 8, 10 seconds or 20 seconds, they're
Right.
going to put it back in the shelf.
Right.
So the first chapter, if they get that far, is to be exciting. So you just don't start like, Bono was born on the south side of Dublin, whatever.
Yeah.
You start off with an exciting moment in the history of the band, something which is almost cinematic,
Yep.
which just leaps off the page that you can just see in your
Yeah.
eyes.
Like Bono was sweating at the edge of the stage.
Right,
His,
right.
his equipment hadn't arrived and stuff like that.
I mean,
Okay.
in my case, they told me, said, try something, just try to find the most exciting moment from the book and jam it right up front. And then you backtrack.
Wow.
So I wrote about seeing them at in where was that, Indiana? And it was outside of Cleveland. And the Coliseum was 20 miles out of town. And after the show, and this is a unforgettable fire tour. They were pretty big at this point. After the show, I'm getting a ride in the limo back to Cleveland with them, and which is 20 miles away. And it's the end of the show. Everybody's been talking backstage. The visitors have come and gone. The listeners who won contests have been greeted and gone. Everybody's gone. The crew is breaking down the show, and the band is going to head back to the hotel. And so there's 3 or 4 limos, and they come out of the parking lot at this place. I think it's the Richfield Coliseum. And they come out, and there's a bunch of cars waiting by the backstage gate for the limos. And so the limos start driving on the highway back to Cleveland, and all of a sudden these cars are like weaving in and around. It's kind of like a Road Warrior movie, when they're jumping on top of the car and trying to get in or firing, Anyway, it's like cowboys and Indians. These guys are in their cars driving alongside the limousines all tighten up so nobody can get in front of them. I mean, it's really like a crazy scene. It's a convoy going 60 miles an hour. And I just remember the scene where this car came up on the right side of us driving down the breakdown lane, which was and I'm in a limousine with Adam, the bass player, and one of the managers. And we're sitting in there and we're looking over, and this car comes up on our right, and the window comes down, and there's like this guy driving, and these girls are like, hey, and somebody holds out a piece of paper and a pen to get an autograph. And we're driving 60 miles an hour, and it's like, you almost feel like you could reach over and grab the pen and it'd be really cool. And just as that moment was, can we do this? This bridge comes up, which cuts into the breakdown lane, and the guy sees it and slams on the brakes. And anyway, so I mean, I get excited just telling that story. That's a very brief moment of it, microscopic moment of it, but it leapt off the page, and that's one of the things I learned.
That's great advice. Back to you two coming to town in Boston. What is the history of the dates they came and where they came? The first gig was where, when, and the second gig was where, when?
Well, the first gig was December 13th, 1980 at the Paradise. They were warming up for Beruga Bandit, and Beruga Bandit being a Detroit band that was managed by Bob Seger's manager. And they were not a bad band, but U2 was interested in just getting a short tour of America in and testing the waters and seeing what it was like.
And that was the Paradise. When was the second gig? Where was the second gig?
Second gig was in February, also at the Paradise. They came back on a proper tour, and they sold out 2 shows at the Paradise second time around as headliners.
So I saw one show that at the Paradise, it wasn't very crowded, and Bono had a cold. Yeah. It didn't seem that crowded because I was able to be right at the side of the stage with my foot up on the stage.
Right.
But
are you sure it wasn't that first show?
I can't be sure. It seems awful early for me.
Yeah. Well, they didn't do too many shows at the Paradise. they would quickly move on to Metro, which is
Right.
location of House of Blues, and then Orpheum Theater, and and then from then on they never looked back. They did do a press conference there during the Joshua Tree tour. They did a press conference at the Paradise, which you might have been at, and that would have been just press people. It wouldn't have been a crowd. That was a private gig.
Oh, so what kind of cooperation did you get from the guys?
I got real good cooperation, but what happened eventually with that book was just before it was supposed to come out, I had signed my contract with Faber and Faber. I got my advance. I had finished the book. I had submitted the book, and it was all ready to go. And then, back then it was a lot more difficult to be in contact with people overseas. Email was just starting out, and only professionals really used it. So there was a real gap in trying to keep track of Paul McGuinness and those guys overseas. What eventually happened was that at the last minute, Larry Mullen Jr. got cold feet and got really concerned about the book. And what had happened was, in the time it took me to write it, was Unforgettable Fire to the Joshua Tree. They became so famous during the Joshua Tree so fast. They had 2 #1 hits in America. They sold 10 million copies. They were on the cover of every magazine, and they did a long tour. And I think that they were a little burned out. Anyway, Larry got a little uptight, and I've never really talked much about this because they asked me not to write the book, not to put it out.
Whoa.
And so this is after the point that we've already cooperated for months and years, and everybody knows I was going to write this book. And I said, you can even look at it and check it out. I mean, there wasn't the kind of book. It was a real fan's book, and there was nothing dirty to talk about. The band was pretty squeaky clean.
Right.
It wasn't like there was a secret life that I didn't write about. I wrote about everything, but it was all everything I saw, and everything I saw was all about the music and all about this great band and all about their commitment and their creativity and their brotherhood and the whole deal. It was a very positive book.
So they hadn't looked at it and thought it would be the kind of usual
trash,
dirt scraping kind of thing.
Yeah, but what was confusing was that Paul McGuinness didn't want to single out the guy in the band that had a problem. So he said, they have a problem. And I said, well, you know what? It's too late. I already sent the book in. It's being published now.
The machines are making it right now.
Why couldn't we talk about this like 3 months ago?
Right.
It was that close. Anyway, so the book came out, and the book did really well. It did really well around the world. It came out in many different countries, doing different permutations. But it wasn't until I saw the band, backstage. I was interviewing Edge and Bono in Verona, Italy. And I said to him, hey, I'm really sorry about the book. I didn't know I was going to freak everybody out. I really thought everybody was okay with it. And Bono looked at me like I had 2 heads. What do you mean? And Edge was like, I had no problem with the book. They didn't even know. It was Larry's problem. And I didn't talk about it because I didn't want people to think that I was promoting the book with this controversy. And it wasn't until years later when I saw Larry that we kind of got clean with it. And I basically said, I apologized. And I said, I wouldn't have done that if I realized there was a problem. And he goes, it's okay. And because, that's
he never read it. He didn't know. If he'd looked at it, he would have known.
I think so. But, even if he hadn't read it, what I love about Larry and what I love, I don't know, maybe it's an Irish thing, but when you give your word or apologize and they accept it, it's done. It's
nice.
Okay. Everything's in the past. And it's been that way. But it was a little rocky there for a while, which was really distressing to me because that book was really done from, I tried to be objective. It's hard. If you wrote a book about David Bowie and you were given access to his family to dig into things that he had done, it'd be really hard for you to be objective because you love it so much, you're subjective.
Right.
So but my book I tried to be objective. And so anyway.
Overall, have you run into problems with agents and people like agents in your writing career?
Well, yeah. My agents were great, and they were great. It was publishers, though.
Publishers. Okay.
You gotta keep an eye on 'em. I mean, I remember when in the wake of the book coming out in America and doing really well. I mean, it sold 70,000 copies, which is a pretty serious amount for a music book. I mean,
Yep.
it's for Stephen King, that's chump change. But uh, when it came out in England, I had, at that point, they had accepted that this book was coming out. And I had to promise the band that it would not be marketed as an authorized biography, which I
Okay.
readily agreed to because it wasn't an authorized
Right.
biography. They had actually done an authorized biography. Uh, well, the book comes out in England. Actually, I'm going to show it to you. It was this book. It was Wide Awake in America.
Uh-huh.
And they right away, they know that they're not supposed to market this as the authorized biography. They market it as the authorized biography in all of their press materials. It's like,
Oh no.
next thing I know, I'm getting these phone calls from New York. Paul McGinnis is on the phone with their, stateside managers saying, what's going on? And then I've got to do fire, I got to put out a fire overseas, which is really hard to do, and so you got to keep an eye on things, and things happen, and people kind of fill in the blanks unless you're keeping an eye.
How did that ever get squared away? It never did, right? I mean, they just had to
okay.
believe you when you said I didn't. They did it without my knowledge.
I believe that they believed me, but I had to get on the phone with the publisher, and you have my agent. When you have an overseas deal, at least my deal was, it was the agency gets 15%. That was my deal. But when you cut an overseas deal, your U.S. agent gets 10%, and the overseas agent gets 10%.
Uh-huh.
So, okay, now's the time for them to earn their money. I talked to my agent saying, talk to them, talk to my agent over there, and make this and fix this. And so with the publisher, they fixed it. But as far as image-wise, I had egg on my face because the band had to go on the record and say it wasn't an authorized biography. So I had to go on the radio with the number one morning team in Ireland on their RTE radio in Dublin and lay it all out and apologize and say, this is not what it was. It's not what it is. And so, you do what you got to do. Certainly didn't want to, you do what you have to do. And so it got cleaned up, but it was embarrassing and unprofessional. It was too bad.
Fantastic stories. I never knew this stuff. I love knowing it. Let's move on to the next one was Radio Free Boston, right?
Well, there's actually a book in between. There was a book that I wrote just as I went over to WXLX. It's which is Life on the Road: The Incredible Rock and Roll Adventures of Dinky Dawson.
Oh,
this book is a great book, but it came and went. It was published by Billboard magazine. And Dinky Dawson is a very famous roadie who worked for Fleetwood Mac and Jay Giles and Steely Dan and dozens of bands. And he was the sound guy at the channel because he lived in the area. Dinky.
We all used to interact with Dinky Dawson.
Yeah.
Because we knew him from the channel. And I knew he was kind of famous, but I didn't know how famous and how involved he was in huge rock situations.
Dinky is something else. He's got a mind like a steel trap. There was some hallucinogens involved over the years, which might have taken the edge off. But he remembered and had so much material. And my agent said, we got this guy came in, and he's got this book, and it's 1,000 pages, and he says he knows you, and maybe you guys could come up with something because we can't put out 1,000-page book. And so I got all the materials. I met with Dinky and we worked out an agreement, and it took me 6 months, but I paired his 1,000 pages into a 300+ page book, so it's his story. It's really his experiences and a lot of his words, but then what I learned in writing my first U2 book, I applied to, writing this book and kind of hammering it into shape. And we were both very pleased with what happened. It was, it sold a few thousand copies, but it was a great book.
That's On the Road with Dinky Dawson, or On the Road?
Life on the Road.
Life on the Road.
It's pretty hard to find now. It's I'm sure you can find it on eBay or something. It's not actively sold.
I'm going to try to find a copy.
Yeah. It's
okay. We're going. This is so great. We're obviously going to go longer than we expected. So I hope you don't mind. Let's get to the next one. I believe it goes Radio Free Boston, then Decibel Diaries, or
That's
something
like
that. So Radio Free Boston is the book that you really had no choice but to write. I mean, somebody had to write it. You're a writer, and you were there. So
yeah,
it fell naturally to you.
Well, I was at ZLX for many years. That book was in 2009. I was approached by a publisher, which doesn't happen often. Publisher, a guy named Stephen Hall, who was worked for the publishing house, had read my U2 book, and he was a diehard BCN listener, loved BCN. And in 2009, BCN was, went out of business. And he was heartbroken as a fan, and he thought, my God, there's a great story here. And no story had been written. So he got a hold of me and asked if I'd be interested in writing a book. And what he wanted, though, was a coffee table book. They wanted a big coffee table book filled with pictures, and I would write the commentary. And so that was, I said, no, I don't want to do it. I said, I was really busy. Writing a book when you have a full-time job is really, you really got to compartmentalize your time. I had to get up at 5 a.m. and write for 3 hours and then go to work all day. And I'm useless writing at night because your head's all filled with the details of the day. And so I said no at first, but he kept at me, and he called me again, and he said, look, it'd be great, blah, blah. And so it was going to be on the University Press of New England, which is, it was Dartmouth and Emerson. A bunch of colleges had their own press. So it was cool because there weren't big company expectations of, I could write what book I wanted to. And so I said, well, let me throw something together. And as I started writing this book, we realized it wasn't going to be a coffee table book. It was going to be the book it became, which was an in-depth history. It was it got to where I wanted this to be the book that you would go to if you were a student and you were writing a term paper in WBCN. This would be your main thing. So everything had to be completely accurate, or quoted from people like Charles, who may have had an altered awareness because of chemicals he might have been ingesting, but that's the story. That's what he remembers, so you print that. And so the publishing house came on board, and they said, yeah, you write the book you want to write. And the challenge of that book was that there wasn't a lot written about BCN from the early years. I mean, as it picked up steam in the 80s, I was involved earlier in the decade, and you were involved a little mid to late. And then after I left, but in the early days, when it began in 1968, there was only a few pieces written about it. So I had to go find everybody and interview everybody. And I interviewed over 100 people for that book. I'd like to say I interviewed 104 people.
Because BCN was 104.1.
That's right. My first interview was Joe Rogers, who was the first DJ on the air as a rock station. And it was a delight. And the cool thing was I left BCN in 98 and concentrated on my job at WXLX. And we were in different locations. And here it is 10, 11 years later. And all of a sudden I'm back at BCN, and I'm getting to meet the people that preceded me, the people that were there when I was there, and all the people that came after me, folks like Adam 12 and those guys. I didn't really know them.
Right.
And, and Deke and those guys. And it was just, and Juanita, got to know her better. I worked with those guys sometimes, some of them, but anyway, it was just a joy to explore and then write it, get it written down.
There's a movie about the early days of WBCN, of which you speak. The early days you didn't have much information about initially. That goes up to 74. It's a documentary. It's very, very good, but it's very limited as it only goes up to 74.
Right.
People talk about a movie. Why wouldn't your book be the basis for the other BCN movie?
Well, I think it would make a great movie, an epic. I mean, it's all there. I think you could write a screenplay from it pretty easily, although it'd be challenging. You might have to, I mean, it could be a War and Peace movie. That it could be huge. It could be a two-part.
I know.
Sequel. I mean, it's
for those folks who may watch this piece that we're doing right now who don't know about WBCN. Can you give me the one sentence explanation of BCN in large, like BCN meant this to rock or the nation or culture? How would you describe BCN in one sentence? Like the subtitle of a BCN book, for example.
I've always said that BCN was the Facebook of the times. It's where everybody went for all their information and all their music, and what was happening and what was going to happen. It was a clearinghouse for our culture, and that kind of sums it up the best I can. It was, I think, the best place to be because you were always stimulated and always involved, and you were encouraged to reach out, find new music, to reach out and play when you're on the air. That was a quote from Billy West in the book. He said, "We were encouraged to play." It was like being in a playpen and just, oh, here you go, play. Here's a truck and do this and do that.
You still had to be good at playing, though. You had to. There were rules. I mean,
there were some boundaries.
They were kind of unspoken. It had to be good.
Yeah.
If it sucked, then it was bad.
Right. But it's like a lot of radio stations, and it's talked about WCOZ. Mark Parental talked about COZ before he came over to BCN. He's talking about how there was this great creative entity that a lot of really good people worked at, like Leslie Parmenter and Tommy Hadges had been over there, and and others, but they were kind of constricted. They were constrained. Their creativity had a boundary to it, and there were opportunities that were missed. There was, and it became more of a corporate thing, and we ate them for dinner. And I think that's, eventually they gave up the fight because they weren't allowed to really, the jocks weren't really given the rope they needed to compete. The company got too worried about it. It's like, wow, they're going to get out of control. And so eventually they crashed and burned.
People can tell when it's real, can't they?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the radio I do now at WXLX, I mean, things have evolved a long way. I'm just amazed that I can be on the radio and play music and play what I'm playing and still have an audience and still, I like all the music we play, but it's not like it was on BCN. It's, we're not pretending who we aren't. We're ZLX is a classic rock station. We play hits. That's what we do. We're not trying to do what BCN did. Anybody that has to be very courageous in this time because the corporations and listeners don't have the time of day. They're not willing to suffer a bad song on the radio before punching out. BCN's audience would hang in there. If you play the clunker, they'd still be there when you got done with it.
They'd be there because of you or because of the jock, because they trusted you.
Right. But they also got to believe in the brand. It was like,
right.
BCN, I mean, okay, but the next song is going to be great, or there's going to be something I'm going to miss if I tune out.
Right. And it might have been like they trusted the brand so much that if they didn't like the song, they might think, well, it's kind of my fault. I don't like it.
That's right. That's a good point.
It's my own fault. And the one of the key things at BCN when you were being instructed on choosing your music is, look, if you take a chance, you better come back in the next song with something that's going to kill him. And it 1000%. If you walk a little bit out on a plank, you better come back with Whole Lot of Love or Baba O'Reilly or something like that. So that nobody has to suffer through more than one song at a time ever that is questionable.
Right. Yeah, I know you got to play that. You got to play that game. It's not a game. It's well, it is in a way
It's
because you're
an
trying to
art, I
adventure
think.
something and come back. But it was, I mean, it was so great to write about that because everyone had their memories, and you cross-check through interviews to make sure you arrive at what's accurate. If people disagree about a memory, you put both memories in. So that book was just awesome to write. And yes, it would make a great movie. And if anybody's watching and they're interested in that,
Let's
get a
do it.
hold of me.
Who do you want to play you in the movie?
Jeez, I don't know.
George Clooney?
Well, he might be getting up in years.
Oh, yeah, right. Well, a young George Clooney. Somebody that's like a young George Clooney.
Yeah.
No, let's move on to the next. I have the next one, the Decibel Diaries, because that's significant as well, and it's an interesting and great concept, which also spawned a radio show.
Yeah, I mean, that book came out of the BCN book because the same publisher wanted another book. They said that BCN book did well, and what else could we write about? And I said that I had been to like over 3,000 concerts and that I had a list of those shows. And they said, "You've been to 3,000 shows. You could pick a bunch of shows and write a book out of it." So that's where that book came out.
And you said, okay. Was that an easier one to write?
Well, it was easier because there wasn't interviews involved.
Right.
Yeah. And so, I mean, the BCN book took over 3 years to write just because I was hunting people down and you probably know this. I mean, one of the hardest things about in writing is transcribing interviews. It's a real chore to transcribe interviews and make sure you get everything right and listening back and forth. I mean, I tried to get software to do it. It just doesn't work because you got to train the software to your voice and it gets the words wrong. And so you're spending all your time correcting what the automation tried to do. But it takes a long time to do that. But the Decibel Diaries is based on my notes, my memories, my ticket stubs, any information I would have, going to the library or going to the internet to cross-check these tours and these shows, find out if there's other accounts. And I came up with 50 of the best shows I'd ever been to or significant shows. I mean, everything from Guns N' Roses at the Paradise to a couple of U2 shows to, Jack White at Fenway Park. I mean, it goes all the way.
You must have further had to refine your list by choosing shows that had the best stories associated with them.
Yeah. I mean, for instance, I wanted to do a Grateful Dead story and I had some Grateful Dead experiences, but I just couldn't find a show that had a story that translated. Sometimes it just doesn't work. I had a story about the Jam because seeing the Jam at the Rat was a kind of a life-changing show for me. Earlier we were talking about me listening to Oedipus on the air and getting involved in this new urban music. But I remember going to the Rat and seeing the Jam, and that when they were on stage, that trio, from London, and just they were in the air more than they were on the ground, jumping up and down and playing. Something just clicked. Everything just, oh, this is amazing. So I wanted to write about that concert. But beyond that feeling that I had, I couldn't find anything else I could really grab on to write about. So I had written a lot of descriptions about the Rat in that story. And so I just took those descriptions and I put it in the Police story, which was also at the Rat, describing what the Rat was like, going downstairs, talking to Mitch with
Mitch.
And the cigarette machine, sitting on the cigarette machine. And,
Mitch's hair went like, right.
Yeah.
Okay. How about, this is just a question between two jocks. Do you remember your first MC gig? Because that's a big deal. Being able to go on the stage and associate yourself with the band and be sort of the glue that brings the band together with the audience. Do you remember your first one?
Actually, I don't. But I understand the situation because I got involved in music and in being in radio. I mean, by doing local music. When I started working at TBS, my big thing was local bands. And in fact, one of the jobs I had when I first went to BCN was to handle the local music library. I was just a jock, but that was the thing I would do so I could go in there during the week because I only was on the air on the weekends. And so it's not really intimidating, you know. In other words, you're getting on stage emceeing for, say, the Stompers, who were a great band, doing a local show. And you're like, and you're seeing all your friends out in the audience. You're already friends with the band. It's like, why get nervous, right?
You're at a party, kind of.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, my whole starting of being an MC coming up. I mean, I get nervous MCing. I do, because you know, you don't want to be the guy to mess up the name of the band or something. You know, somebody you know really well, and all of a sudden this crazy thought comes into your mind, and
Oh yeah,
you say the
it
wrong.
could be Aerosmith, and you could blank out
Yeah.
easily. And I think I remember Charles did. I mean, jocks do. It's possible. I remember one time Charles kind of spaced out. This is something that I shouldn't maybe say. It's maybe oversharing, but it was a trick that I instituted. You know, you grab the mic in this hand. I would write the name of the band right here on
right there
on my hand, so I could. It was right in front of my face when I was holding the mic,
A
just
cheat
in
sheet.
case, because it's so overwhelming up there. You could completely space out.
Well, and, you know, well, it's probably even more nerve wracking now because now you got, you know, everybody's got their phones, so your mess up would be recorded by hundreds of
Oh,
people.
no kidding.
It'd be on the internet like within moments. Your shame would be complete.
So there must be. Let's wrap up the Decibel Diaries, and then we can be pretty much done.
There was in the Decibel Diaries was a story about U2 at the Garden, and I got there. They did 4 nights in a row in 2001, summer 2001, All That You Can't Leave Behind tour, and I'll be really quick about it. But I got there the second night, and they said that Bono wanted to see me, which is really irregular. They don't really see people before the show, even their friends. And I get backstage in Bono's dressing room, and he was really sick. He had his face in a humidifier. He had a terry cloth robe on, and he was just like, and his hair was all, I was like, you're going on stage in an hour, man. He was really sick, and he asked if I would get on stage and talk. They were filming that night, and there were all these cameras in the way, and they wanted me to apologize for the band for all the cameras that were in the way, and that he wanted me to remind the younger audience about about U2's special connection to Boston. And he asked if I would go up on stage and do that maybe 10 minutes before they go on. So, you know, what am I going to say? No. So, and you can relate to this because after I said, yes, I will do this, Paul McGuinness escorted me back to they always had a bar backstage, and all their friends could sit and drink.
Where was this again?
This is at the Garden.
Okay.
And so I'm back at the Garden now, and I've got an hour to wait before I'm going to get on stage. Basically, you're twisting in the wind, right? You just want to get it done.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm back there, and I'm with my wife, and we're drinking at the bar, and there's people coming up to me, and they're like, you basically just see their mouths moving while your head is like figuring out what you're going to do. And you know, part of your brain is trying to be polite. The other part of your brain is trying to figure out what you're going to say and what the last word is going to be in each sentence that will cue you to your next thing. You know, and it's kind of I don't know. It's really an uncomfortable feeling. I mean, it's excitement, but you don't want to screw it up, you know?
Right. That was a particularly uncomfortable situation because usually when you go up on stage, the audience is going to get rewarded because right after that, the band comes on. But in this case, you had to go up there and go, they're not coming right out now. So it's kind of, kind of mumble grumble.
You got to remind yourself that it's not about you. You know, it's not about you. It's going to be, here comes the train, and jump out of the way, you know, basically. That's really the way it is. You just got to keep your mind on what you're doing.
So, you're a writer, and writers don't stop writing, do they? What's next?
Well, I probably should have written something by now because the Decibel Diaries came out in 2013, but I spent a long time promoting it. I did like 40, 50 book signings in libraries, and I really had a good time doing that. And then the pandemic kind of ended it. And so I've been poised to write something, but my problem has been I need to figure out what I want to write about. You can't give this huge chunk of your life and time to something unless you're 100% committed.
Right.
You won't put the time in.
Unfortunately, either
what's that?
fortunately or unfortunately, in the past, people have come to you and said, write this book, Carter. You didn't have to do what you're doing now, which is figure out what to write.
Right. And I'm still working a full-time job. So, it's really, the time is limited. So I have some ideas. The other thing is, like, you want to write a book that is not challenged by the internet. The internet is competition. If people like in the old days, before internet, there were a lot of books that would go and talk about chart positions of bands, like their hit singles and how high they went up, and then talk about the singles and talk about the bands, or talk about hit albums, like the Who had, two number 2 albums, never had a number, stuff like that. Those kind of books don't sell anymore because you could just go online and
Right.
get the information. So you got to write something that you can't get online.
Yeah.
You got to find something. And so it makes it harder, especially if I wanted to write a music oriented book, a nonfiction oriented book. So I'm still searching. I still have ideas for that. A novel is another idea, but that's another level.
That's hard, man. Because writing dialogue that's not terrible is a challenge, I guess.
It is. And the other thing that I've talked to my wife about is, when you create a world in a novel and you create characters in that world, to write effectively, you kind of got to stay in that world, at least while you're writing. And if I'm only writing for 2 or 3 hours, then all of a sudden, it takes a little while to get in the zone. You're in the zone for what, 2 hours? Then you're out of the zone and out on the Mass Pike. And you really need to spend all day at it. So it might be that I'm not going to ever write a novel until that's my main gig. So I don't know. We'll see.
Carter Allen, thanks so much for letting everyone get to know you better. And that includes me. There's so much stuff in here that I didn't know. Like, I didn't know that your initial dream was to write for the Boston Globe.
I do want to, and then Jim Sullivan and Steve Morris took that job, and I was never going to have it.
Right. They did that for 30 years or something.
Yeah. And it's, the other thing is, it's sad that there's been a lot of, that the newspapers of the world have taken a hit from the internet, and they've laid off staff, and people like Steve Morris and Jim Sullivan lost their gigs. I'm glad they're still, writing in blogs and keeping active, because that's what they love to do,
All right, brother. Well, stay healthy and stay productive.
You too, Bradley. Take care of yourself, man.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
That's it. Let's end this.
All right.
We're clear.
That was cool.